Now we need to turn to the second point of evidence, and that is, wouldn't you want to know who did it? And not that there's an intelligence, but can we figure out who the intelligence is? Well, I think so. By identifying his fingerprints that are revealed in history. We saw the fingerprints in nature. Now we need to look at the fingerprints of this intelligent being in history. Who is this intelligent designer? Well, we have the earth, and the fingerprints of intelligence are all over the earth and beyond. We maintain that there's a circle out there called God. God, in every religion, struggles with how can they know whether the circle is a reality. Because you get on tiptoe and you look and you go up on top of a mountain and you look, and the Russian space travelers, they went out and they said they didn't see God anywhere out there either. So how in the world are we supposed to see this circle? And how are we supposed to identify who the intelligent designer is? Well, the designer took care of that. 2,000 years ago, an event happened in the Middle East. And an angel, is what the allegation is of the Bible, came and announced that there was one coming whose birth was unprecedented. He would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. The Christian position is that what we see of design in the natural world, that designer became flesh and lived with us here for 33 years in order to reveal more about that designer so that we could know for certain who it is. No other religion has such a concept except Christianity. The others are going to constantly be looking and looking, but they can't find. Christianity claims the designer came to us. Not just to us. We don't monopolize that. He came for everyone in the world. That's the significance of Christmas. God appeared in history, or at this point, we can say the designer, the intelligence. But once he gets here in person, it turns into a scientific study, because now you can look at the person who came to determine whether or not he's real, legitimate, the genuine article. It's no longer pie in the sky, no longer a phantom, no longer a ghost. It's a real being. Is he more than a human being? That's the question, of course. There are plenty of voices of unbelief. Bart Ehrman, in his book Misquoting Jesus, says the Bible is a false idol. Da Vinci Code, everything our fathers taught us about Christ is wrong. They can say that. They have a right to. And it also behooves us to say, what is my answer? Because their position is, this is not history. It's mythology. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the stories of Jesus, you can't trust those. They're from 2,000 years ago. How do you know it's true? We need to look at that. Because without that, our source material about this man who came 2,000 years ago is in here. If this is false, not historically true, then we don't have a case. We can believe it if we want to, but it's kind of like, I'm going to hold on to it because I'm feeling rather insecure without it. I want to know if it's true. I want to see the evidence. So we're going to look at, is it material about Jesus that is eyewitness in nature? Or did it develop and come about years later? For example, on this particular slide, Jesus died and arose according to Christian faith, according to the Bible, about 30 A.D. in the first century. As you can see, by the time we hit 100 A.D., that's called the eyewitness time period. Probably after 100, there's nobody alive who ever met Jesus. All the eyewitnesses are dead. If we're claiming this is eyewitness material about Jesus, then we've got to prove it was written in the eyewitness time period. The consensus of scholarship prior to the last 40 years was that it was written down here after at least 3 generations of verbal or oral transmission. And guess what? All the material we have from down there 160 on into the 3rd century, are usually classified as legends. And if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are also from that time period, how are you going to separate them from the legends? For example, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, none of which are in the Bible. But they're all late, and none of those people, Mary Magdalene, Judas, Philip, wrote those. They're called pseudonymous writings. Pseudo, meaning false, ascribed to them. How did they know that they should put Philip's name on that when it arose at the end of the 2nd century? When Philip has been dead for more than 100 years. They must have found Philip's name somewhere else. And they knew he was associated with this Jesus. Same thing with Mary Magdalene. They would have had to find out that Mary Magdalene was an associate of Jesus. And therefore, since she didn't publish, you publish for her and pretend she wrote it to give it credibility. But they had to get those names from somewhere. And of course, the position I have, and I can prove that, they already had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they read those and found out about Philip, about Judas, about Mary Magdalene. They had no materials written, so they wrote it for them and put their name on it. How do I come to that conclusion? It wasn't so long ago that they found a fragment of the Gospel of John that dates to around 120 to 125 AD. Obviously, John couldn't have been written down here if we already see portions of it here. That was the first clue, that maybe we had it wrong. Maybe we didn't get this right about when they were in written form. Then came along a collection of writings called the Apostolic Fathers. These are the people that wrote here, 90 to 110, this area here, but they were born too late to have ever met Jesus. They were born after he was gone. But where did they get their information from? From the apostles, therefore the Apostolic Fathers, the apostles who were with Jesus and spent their life with him and then gradually died as the century rolled out. And these are the students of those eyewitness apostles. Their writings are collected here in Greek and then translated into English. And my goodness, amazing what they found when they started looking at the writings of these people. By AD 110, in other words, 110 and before, Polycarp, a student of the Apostle John, wrote letters and materials, and in those letters they found him quoting 18 of the New Testament books. Obviously, those 18 must have already been in existence by 110. Ignatius, by 108. In his writings, he quotes or refers to 24. How many New Testament books are there? 27. In other words, Ignatius quotes all but 3 of the New Testament books, so that almost the entire New Testament must have been in existence by 108 in written form. Finally, Clement. By AD 96, we're now in the 1st century, he refers to 11 books, including all the synoptics of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The others refer to even John in their time frame. What this tells us is that at least 25 of the 27 New Testament books must have been in circulation by about AD 95 and had to have been written prior to that in order to be available. And as the slow process was of scribal copying of these, there would be nothing to distribute if they didn't arise earlier and they had time to copy these. Therefore, we are well into the eyewitness generation, but it even gets better. In recent times, there have been fragments being found like this one, the Magdalen Manuscript, found at Magdalen College, Oxford University. They didn't even know they had it or what they had, but Dr. Karsten Peter Thede identified that as a portion of Matthew's Gospel from about AD 66. We're within 36 years of Jesus' life itself. And it's already in written form. Not in oral transmission, because the concern about oral transmission, like a fish story, it gets bigger and bigger over the years. They exaggerate. But when you write within the eyewitness generation, you're also writing to your enemies, who would be like to do no better than to show that you are wrong. To exaggerate is to destroy your credibility when the eyewitnesses are persecuting you, and would like to find that as well. In Manuscript, if you go to one of the websites that I find in my book, in here, you'll find that Wallace has now a manuscript of Mark he has published, or he hasn't published it yet, but he's referred to it. It's already made the circles to papyrologists who are experts in these ancient manuscripts, and there seems to be a consensus that they have a fragment of the Gospel of Mark that is middle of first century. As you know, most scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel to be composed, and Luke and Matthew and John followed later. But all four in the first century. Even skeptics, Time magazine, publications on the Dead Sea Scrolls today are all agreeing that the Gospels of Jesus Christ were all written in the eyewitness first century. So our first question, our first test of whether or not these records should be trusted in any way, we want to make sure they came from eyewitnesses and not having legendary sources from a later century. Let's go to the second test. All right, so they did it okay, but they got changed en route to us. I mean, after all, that was 2,000 years ago. They have to be copied over 2,000 years. Obviously, they've been changed, and so what we're reading can't be trusted. That's the typical story. I have here a book written by one of the emperors of the Roman Empire, Julius Caesar. Wrote it 50 years before Christ. Not too bad a shape for being that old, is it? How do you get a printed paperback of something that Julius Caesar wrote 1,500 years before a printing press, which occurred in the 15th century? Scribes. Professional people whose work consisted of copying. And so for 1,500 years, this got copied by scribes. They didn't go back to his original every time to get a copy. They'd have one generation, then the second generation would come from the first generation, the third generation would come from the third and second, and on down the line they keep copying. And obviously, you assume the accumulation of error, the accumulation of mistakes. And that we know that there are some variations, and that could happen. The question, of course, for scholars to find out if a work from ancient times got to us with integrity, the way it originally was written without any substantial change, is to ask the question, how many manuscripts are we finding of this work? How many manuscripts? Why? The more manuscripts you have, the more you can compare. And the more you're able to detect changes that some scribe over here in Alexandria made compared to the one in Rome. And pretty soon you can, with many manuscripts, you can basically find the errors and restore the original. Because, folks, what you have to understand is that there are no originals of any ancient writings. We are entirely dependent on what we read today from ancient times on a reconstruction from scribal manuscripts. So the more you have, the more confident you are that you are reconstructing it correctly. Well, you can see here that we have lots of manuscripts. Look at Homer's Iliad, that one on the right, 1,757 manuscripts. Keep in mind, the way scholars count manuscripts is not a whole book. If I had one page, that counts as one that they find in a garbage heap in some city somewhere over there. If I have one word or two, it counts as one. If I have the whole book, it counts as one. So many of these manuscripts are not whole manuscripts. They at least represent some portion of this, which is 251. This book is reconstructed from 251 scribal manuscripts, and we hope this is what Julius Caesar wrote. We hope that the manuscripts we're using represent what he really wrote. Well, let's take a look. If anything can be reconstructed with very, very highly refined accuracy, it would be the New Testament, with over 24,000 manuscripts, 5,500 in Greek, 10,000 in Latin, Syriac, Ugarit, a host of other languages, all prior to the printing press, all handwritten, all copied like this. The best, by far. I'm only doing comparative literature study. I'm not quoting it. I'm simply doing what any literature class in a secular university should be doing. This is common knowledge and common publication. The next issue is for scholars, not only how many manuscripts, but how early are they? You see, if I had this in 50 BC, and I had there's a manuscript from 50 AD, 100 years later. Is that good? That's very good. Very little time for the accumulation of any error, because it represents very few generations of copying. So scholars want manuscripts to get as close to the originals as possible. The bigger the gap, the less certainty you have that you have one that hasn't been changed. So where do we find this? Well, 900 AD. You want to know what this looked like in 200 AD? You can't. No manuscripts exist. 500 AD? You can't. No manuscripts exist. 1000 AD? Yeah, you got one from 900. And you have to hope that the scribes didn't change anything for 950 years of copying. But you can't know. You have to trust that 901 and following, put this together and send it out and said, this is what Julius Caesar wrote. Aristotle wrote Poetics in the 4th century before Christ. There are no manuscripts until 1100 AD. It was copied for over 1,400 years. As far as I know, no professor anywhere in any university questions the integrity of what we're reading of Aristotle's writing. The best you can get is Virgil writing about the same time as Julius Caesar, and the manuscripts occur about 300 years later. But notice that no manuscripts go back into the century in which the author lived. Therefore, there's always a gap and always the question, I wonder if someone changed it during this time. The New Testament was written in the 1st century, all 27 books between about 45 and 100 AD. Remember when we were looking at the manuscripts? Where were we finding manuscripts? What century? The same century, the first. The gap between the original authors and the first known manuscript, even though they're fragments, they demonstrate that it was in written form. And we have whole manuscripts in the 2nd century. Not only that, you say, well, wait a minute, they probably changed somewhere down the road. We have manuscripts not only early, but in every century between Jesus and the printing press. Did they change? Go look at the manuscripts. They're in every century. You can demonstrate whether they did or did not change. And I can, with all confidence, pick this up with the number of manuscripts used to reconstruct it and the earliness of the manuscripts. I can hold it in my hand and be confident, completely assured, that what I'm reading is what eyewitnesses of Jesus wrote 2,000 years ago. One more. There's always the question, why would you think this is history? Even though it came from the eyewitnesses and it got transmitted to us without any significant change, here we have to use the field of science called archaeology. Go and look up, are the people mentioned real? Are the places real? Are the events real? I can only give you some samples. Here's a coastline of the Mediterranean at a place called Caesarea Maritima. There, when they were doing excavation of that city, they came across a building stone, and on that building stone was the name of Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, where Caesarea Maritima is located, and Tiberius, who was the emperor of the Roman Empire, showing that they were contemporaries, ruled at the same time. You turn to Luke chapter 3, verse 1. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea. Luke claims he researched everything carefully and gave his reader a chronological and real order of what took place surrounding the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. There are many, many examples of his trustworthiness. But in this, we find that those are not fictitious names. Those are names of history, or this bone box. For a period of about 100 years, from 30 years before Christ to about 70 A.D., when the Romans came and destroyed the temple and overthrew Israel, they practiced the concept of secondary burial. Someone would die, they would be wrapped in a burial cloth with lots of spices which dehydrate the body. Put in a cave, and a year later, when they come back and take off the cloth, you have only the skeleton, and everything is shrunk down to a parchment-like skin covering the bones of the skeleton. All the water is gone. Now they take the bones of the skeleton all apart. You have a pile of bones. You put those in that box. It's only about 2 feet long, a foot high, and a foot deep. Just big enough so like the hip bones and stuff like that would be able to get in there and get the lid on. And then you take the box and carve the name of the person whose bones are in there. And you put it back in the cave, line them up on the wall, becomes their cemetery. If they own land and they have a limestone cave, that becomes the place where they put themselves and all their relatives. They were doing road construction in Jerusalem about 1990. And all of a sudden, just south of the Temple Mount, in the city of David, and all of a sudden one of the heavy pieces of equipment just broke down into the ground and sunk a ways, and they got it out, and they realized what had happened is that the equipment sunk through and broke through the roof of a limestone cave. They had no idea it was there. When they went in and took out some of the dirt, they found this box and 3 others. By the way, this one's pretty cool, don't you think? This person is either very famous or quite wealthy to have one carved like that. The name on the end was Joseph Caiaphas. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest. Josephus, a Jewish historian late in the 1st century, writes about this same man, and he says he was not just Caiaphas, it's like our last name. He was Joseph Caiaphas, so we have confirmation from another writer that the high priest was Joseph Caiaphas. Everyone agrees what they had found was the burial cave of the high priest's family at the time of Jesus. The people in the Bible, in the New Testament at least, the Gospels, are real. They're not fictitious. They're not mythology. If you went up to Capernaum in the Galilee, you'd come to a synagogue. The synagogue is where Jesus taught according to the Gospels. Well, sure, there is a synagogue there, sure enough. Well, yeah, but maybe that was later. Well, yes, the one above here, this is probably 3rd or 4th century construction. But down where the arrow's pointing down here, this layer here dates to the 1st century. That was the floor of the synagogue in Capernaum that Jesus walked on and taught in. That's the synagogue that was there. The places that I referred to in the New Testament, in the Gospels, are real. You can go there. That's why people go there to Holy Land, because they can trace the steps of Jesus, and the cities and the places and everything are still there. It's cast into history, not into mythology. The crucifixion was a point of contention for many people because the Gospels have Jesus crucified with nails. Well, scholars knew that the Romans didn't use nails at the time of Jesus. They didn't start using nails until late in the 2nd century, and everybody agreed with that. They said at the time of Jesus, he'd have been tied with cords to the cross, not nailed. But there it is. Thomas says, unless I see the nails in his hand and in his feet, I will not believe. And Jesus comes up to him and says, Thomas, look. And they assume nails. The scholarship said they're wrong. Obviously, they were not eyewitnesses, and they didn't know any better. Until another bone box was found in Jerusalem, had the bones of the ankles and feet and the nail still there, pounded through them. And when this was published in Biblical Archaeology Review, this person was crucified in Jerusalem somewhere between 25 and 42 AD. Remember, Jesus was around 30 to 33, right in the middle of that time period. The Romans were using nails. The scholarship consensus was wrong. The gospel writers were right. The events in the Bible are real. I give many more examples of that kind of archaeology in the second chapter of my book, Surprised by Faith. I'll tell you my story in just a moment. I was not a believer. I didn't trust this stuff. I was a devout evolutionist when I finished my PhD. Something happened that transformed and changed me. Let's take and go further before we get there. Once again, I'm only using the Bible to confirm what I've found from external evidence. Peter tells us in his second epistle, second letter, we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty, and the external evidence supports him in that. What do I do with it then? I don't feel that I have to come to you and prove to you that this is the inspired Word of God. It's inerrant. It's infallible. I didn't prove that to you. I don't feel I need to. All I do is challenge you. All external evidence would remove almost all doubt that what you're reading is what eyewitnesses who were with Jesus heard him say and saw him do. All I'm demonstrating to you is that you have a historical record of the man who came 2,000 years ago, and to ignore that is not wise. To take a look at it as history and eyewitness quality. And you'll find that Jesus claimed to be God. He claimed to be within those pages according to the eyewitnesses who were there. Pretend you're taking a field trip and you're jumping into the shoes of the people who were there. And you're using their ears. They heard him say he was the Messiah. They heard him say he's God, Lord God. He's the I am, the name for God from Exodus chapter 3. The I am that I am, the one with the Father, one meaning equal to or the same essence as the Father. He's the person who says, I have authority and power to assure you of eternal life. He says, I have all authority in heaven and on earth. Why would you believe a guy like that? Maybe they should lock him up. It sounds kind of crazy until you jump in with your field trip and you start using your eyes. Through the people who were there, you see what he did. He demonstrated his power and authority over the entire moral realm of sin and evil, the physical realm of even bodily illness. He demonstrated his authority over death. On 3 occasions, he raised people from the dead, including, and fourthly, himself. Folks, the significance of that should not be missed. No one has ever demonstrated authority and power over death. And nature. I'm a scientist. These are the laws of nature. And Jesus is the lawmaker. On one occasion, there was a storm, and he simply spoke, and it became quiet, and they were afraid they were going to die out there on the Sea of Galilee. And their response was, who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? Call it mythology if you want, but you have to go back and say, how did mythology get in to the eyewitness writings at that time period? Because it didn't get added in any century after that. We can be assured of that because of the manuscripts. And his power over the spirit world. And when you get somebody with those qualities, you're not being a fool when you suggest that that's not just some man. A man, to be sure. But they identified the God-man. And that's what he claimed. That's who he said he was. And in his 3.5-year ministry, he demonstrated why it was true, why they should believe him. That's another whole story. If you ever have a chance, if you want to hear the rest of all that, it's a series that I call Discovery. And there I go into the evidence from Jesus' life and what he said and did and some other things as well. For this one, I need to wrap it up and bring it to a conclusion here.